Hello my friends, welcome to another night of Fireside Mysteries. I'm Edward, your host, also from Warm Pages. Before we begin, is there a place from your past, a town, a street, a little shop, that you still think about fondly? Share a memory with us in the comments. I treasure reading them. And don't forget to subscribe. Now relax, our story is ready to unfold. Chapter 1. The Star over Loch Dubh. The winter wind howled down from the mountains like a banshee with a grievance, rattling the windows of the Loch Dubh police station, where Police Sergeant Hamish Macbeth sat with his feet propped on the desk, a mug of tea cooling in his hand. His dog Lugs, a mongrel of indeterminate heritage with the lugubrious expression that had earned him his name, lay stretched before the peat fire, occasionally opening one eye to check that all was well with his world. Hamish sipped his tea and gazed out at the darkness beyond the window. December in Sutherland was a time when night seemed to claim most of the day for itself, and the villagers of Loch Dubh had taken to their annual tradition of erecting an illuminated star atop the church tower. It was meant to spread goodwill and festive cheer, though Hamish privately thought that the whole business was more trouble than it was worth. Still, tradition was tradition, and the Highlands ran on tradition the way Glasgow ran on rain and gossip. The new minister, Reverend Alistair Munro, had arrived from Edinburgh 3 months earlier, full of enthusiasm and modern ideas about parish engagement. He was a tall, thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles that gave him the look of an earnest schoolmaster, and he had thrown himself into the Christmas preparations with an energy that had left the older parishioners somewhat breathless and faintly suspicious. Hamish had met the Reverend only twice, both times at village functions where small talk was required, and Hamish's natural laziness made him avoid anything that might lead to work. The man had seemed pleasant enough, if a bit intense, with a habit of fixing people with a penetrating stare as if trying to read their souls through their foreheads. The phone on Hamish's desk rang, shattering the peaceful evening. Lugs raised his head with a grumble of protest. "Loch Dubh Police," Hamish answered, his Highland accent more pronounced than usual. He had been nearly asleep. "Hamish! Oh, Hamish, you must come at once." The voice belonged to Mrs. Catriona Bell, the church secretary, and it was shaking badly despite her obvious efforts at control. Hamish's feet came off the desk with a thump. Mrs. Bell was not the sort of woman given to hysteria. She was capable, cheerful, and had run the parish office with ruthless efficiency for the past 5 years. "What's happened, Mrs. Bell?" "It's the Reverend. He's fallen. Down the church steps. I think he might be dead." Hamish was already pulling on his jacket, the phone wedged between his shoulder and ear. "Have you called an ambulance?" Yes, but Hamish, I think it's too late. There's blood, and he's so still, and the star is shining right down on him like... Her voice broke. "I'll be there in 5 minutes. Don't touch anything, Mrs. Bell. Can you do that for me?" Yes, I can do that." Hamish rang off and looked at Lugs, who had risen to his feet with the resigned air of a dog who knew his warm fireside evening was over. "Come on then, work calls." The drive to the church took less than 5 minutes through the dark, empty streets of Loch Dubh. The village was quiet, most sensible folk already indoors against the bitter cold. As Hamish pulled up before the old stone church, he could see the great illuminated star blazing from atop the tower, its white light stark against the black sky. It cast a cold, theatrical glow over the scene below. Mrs. Catriona Bell stood at the bottom of the church steps, her arms wrapped around herself, staring down at the crumpled figure of Reverend Munro. She looked up as Hamish approached, her round face pale in the starlight. "I was just finishing the decorations inside," she said, her voice steadier now, but still thin with shock. "He said he wanted to check the star one more time, make sure the wiring was secure. I heard a cry and then a terrible sound, like someone falling. When I came out, he was lying here." Hamish knelt beside the body, careful not to disturb anything. Reverend Munro lay on his back, his limbs at awkward angles, his spectacles shattered beside his head. Blood had pooled beneath him, dark against the frozen ground. His eyes were open, staring up at the star he had been so proud of. Hamish felt for a pulse he knew he would not find. The man was dead, and had been for at least 15 minutes judging by the temperature of the skin. He stood and looked up at the church steps. They were steep and old, the stone worn smooth by centuries of feet, and tonight they gleamed with a thin coating of ice. "He must have slipped," Mrs. Bell said, following his gaze. "The steps are treacherous when they freeze. I've told them we need salt put down, but does anyone listen? When did you last see him alive?" Mrs. Bell pressed a hand to her forehead, thinking. "Perhaps 20 minutes ago. I was arranging the nativity scene by the altar. He said he'd be back down shortly, and we'd lock up together." The wail of an ambulance siren cut through the night, growing louder as it approached. Hamish put a gentle hand on Mrs. Bell's shoulder. "You've had a terrible shock. Why don't you wait in my car where it's warm? I'll need to take a proper statement from you, but it can wait until you've had a cup of tea." She nodded gratefully and allowed herself to be led away. As Hamish waited for the ambulance crew and Dr. Jennifer Dalrymple, who served as the local doctor and police surgeon, he stood looking up at the bright star. It was meant to symbolise hope and peace, goodwill to all men. But tonight it shone down on Amon Death, and Hamish Macbeth felt the familiar prickle at the back of his neck that told him something was not quite right about this scene. It might look like an accident, neat and simple, but in Hamish's experience things were rarely as simple as they first appeared, especially when a man died during preparations for a festival meant to celebrate peace on earth. He sighed and pulled his coat tighter against the wind. So much for a quiet Christmas in Lockdub. Chapter 2. A Death That Darkens Christmas. Dr. Jennifer Dalrymple arrived at the church in her battered Land Rover, climbing out with the brisk efficiency that characterised everything she did. She was a small, compact woman in her late 40s, with iron-grey hair cut short and a no-nonsense manner that had served her well in the Highlands, where people respected plain speaking and distrusted sentiment. "Well, Hamish," she said, pulling on latex gloves as she approached the body, "what have we got?" "Reverend Munro appears to have fallen down the church steps. Mrs. Bell found him about half an hour ago." De Dalrymple knelt beside the dead man, her examination thorough and methodical. Hamish watched her face, noting the way her eyebrows drew together as she studied the head wound. After several minutes, she sat back on her heels and looked up at him. "He didn't just fall, Hamish. No. No!" She pointed to the back of Munro's head without touching it. "See this? The pattern of the injury is wrong for a fall down steps. He's been struck with something heavy and blunt before he went down those stairs. The other injuries are consistent with the fall, but this one came first. I'd stake my reputation on it." Hamish felt that prickle at the back of his neck intensify. "Murder, then?" "Murder," de Dalrymple confirmed. She stood and brushed off her knees. "I'll need to do a proper post-mortem to be certain. But you're looking at foul play here. Someone coshed him on the head, probably from behind, and then either pushed him down the steps or let gravity do the work." "Time of death?" "Given the temperature and the state of the body, I'd say between 7 and 8 o'clock this evening. I can narrow it down more once I've had him on the table." Hamish glanced at his watch. It was now just past 9. He looked over at his police Land Rover where Mrs. Bell sat wrapped in a blanket, a thermos of tea from the ambulance crew clutched in her hands. She had been calm, helpful, exactly as one would expect from a woman of her competence. But had she been too calm? "I'll need to secure the scene," Hamish said, "and inform Detective Chief Inspector Blair." Dr. Dalrymple snorted. Blair was the bane of Hamish's existence. A Glasgow detective who treated the Highlands as a barbaric wilderness and Hamish as a lazy provincial who needed constant supervision. "Rather you than me. He'll be delighted to leave his Christmas shopping to come up here and stomp about in the cold. Well, can't be helped." By the time the ambulance had taken Reverend Munro's body away, and Hamish had cordoned off the church with police tape, word had spread through Lockdub with the speed that only village gossip could achieve. Lights had come on in houses, and small clusters of people had gathered at a respectful distance, watching and whispering. Hamish took Mrs. Bell's statement in the warmth of his police station, lug settled at her feet as if offering canine comfort. She had recovered somewhat from the initial shock and answered his questions with her characteristic precision. The Reverend had been here since September, she said, sipping the fresh cup of tea Hamish had made. He replaced Reverend Macpherson, who retired. Nice enough man, very enthusiastic about everything, sometimes too enthusiastic, if you know what I mean. How so? Mrs. Bell considered her words carefully. He had ideas about modernising the parish, wanted to start discussion groups, youth programmes, community outreach. All very well and good, but this is Loch Dubh, not Edinburgh. Folk here don't take kindly to being pushed into things. Did he have any enemies? Enemies? Mrs. Bell looked shocked. Goodness, no. I mean, there were disagreements, but enemies is rather strong. What sort of disagreements? She shifted in her chair, uncomfortable. Angus Fraser, the church elder, wasn't happy about the Reverend's plan to audit the church finances, said it showed a lack of trust, and Morag Campbell was upset because the Reverend started asking questions about her late husband's death. That was 5 years ago, mind you, and ruled accidental. No idea why he wanted to rake all that up again. Hamish made notes, his writing neat despite the speed. Anyone else? Ewan Mackay, our caretaker. The Reverend gave him a talking to last week about letting standards slip. Ewan's been doing that job for 10 years without complaint, and suddenly he's not good enough. Left him quite bitter, I can tell you. And how did you get along with Reverend Munro? Mrs. Bell met his gaze squarely. We worked together well enough. He relied on me to keep things running smoothly, and I did my job. That's all there was to it. After Mrs. Bell had gone home, Hamish sat at his desk and thought. Murder in Loch Dubh was rare enough to be remarkable, and murder of a minister during Christmas preparations was almost unheard of. The village would be in turmoil, suspicion settling over it like a pall. The phone rang again. It was Detective Chief Inspector Blair, and he was as disagreeable as Dr. Dalrymple had predicted. What's this about a dead minister, Macbeth? Blair's voice was thick with irritation and whisky. Can you not keep your wee village under control for even one Christmas? Murder's no respecter of holidays, sir, Hamish said mildly. Dr. Dalrymple's confirmed it was foul play. Aye. Well, I'll be up there tomorrow morning with D.S. Anderson. See, you've got statements from everyone who was at that church tonight. And Macbeth? Sir? Don't go playing the detective. You're a village bobby, not Sherlock Holmes. Leave the real police work to professionals. Hamish hung up after Blair had rung off and looked at Lugs. Professionals, he said to the dog. He couldn't detect his way out of a paper bag if you drew him a map. Lugs thumped his tail in Russian agreement. The next morning dawned grey and bitter, with snow threatening in the heavy clouds. Hamish walked through the village, noting the closed curtains and subdued atmosphere. Christmas decorations that had seemed cheerful yesterday now looked garish and inappropriate. The church sat silent and empty, the police tape fluttering in the wind. He stopped at the bakery where Jessie Curry held court over her counter, the source of more gossip than the local newspaper. Terrible business, Hamish, she said, wrapping 2 morning rolls for her worm. Who'd want to kill a minister? That's what I'm trying to find out, Jessie. Did you notice anything unusual about Reverend Munro lately? Jessie leaned forward, her eyes bright with the importance of having information. Well, now that you mention it, he had been meeting with folk privately. Urgent-like. He called it pastoral care, but it seemed more like interrogations to me. Angus Fraser came out of one meeting looking like thunder, and Morag Campbell was in tears after hers. Did he meet with you? No, thank the Lord. I've got nothing to confess that the village doesn't already know. She laughed at her own joke, then sobered. But he told me something odd when he bought his bread last week. Said Christmas was a time for truth before celebration, that everyone should examine their conscience and make things right. Hamish filed this away and continued his rounds. By the time he returned to the police station, the village had fully awakened to the reality of murder in their midst. The church would remain closed, perhaps for days. The Christmas services were in doubt. And somewhere among the familiar faces of Loch Dubh walked a killer who had struck down a man of God beneath the symbol meant to bring peace and hope. Hamish looked at the case file he was building, thin as it was. 3 people with grievances against the Reverend. a church secretary who had found the body, and a dead man who had been stirring up the past just before Christmas. He had the uncomfortable feeling that this case would reveal more about Loughdub than anyone wanted known. Small villages kept their secrets close, buried deep beneath layers of propriety and silence. Reverend Munro had been digging into those secrets, and someone had killed him for it. The question was which secret had been worth murder, and whose hand had struck the fatal blow. Outside, the first snow began to fall, soft and silent, covering the village like a shroud. Chapter 3: A Shepherd with Secrets. Detective Chief Inspector Blair arrived in Loughdub like a foul-weather system, bringing with him Detective Sergeant Jimmy Anderson in an air of aggrieved superiority. He established himself in the church hall, commandeering a table, and treating the village as if it were enemy territory requiring occupation. "Right then, Macbeth," Blair said, his face already red from the drive up through the snowy passes. "What have you got for me?" Hamish handed over his notes with the placid expression he always adopted around Blair. It was an expression that suggested he was slow-witted and lazy, two qualities that made Blair dismiss him as harmless. This suited Hamish perfectly. Dr. Dalrymple says the Reverend was struck from behind, then fell or was pushed down the steps. Time of death between 7 and 8 last evening. Mrs. Bell found the body around 8:30. And suspects? 3 parishioners had recent conflicts with the Reverend. Angus Fraser, church elder, objected to a financial audit. Morag Campbell was upset about questions regarding her late husband's death. Ewan Mackay, the caretaker, was reprimanded for poor work. Blair grunted. "Typical village nonsense. Bring them in for questioning. We'll have this sorted before Christmas." Jimmy Anderson caught Hamish's eye and gave a subtle shake of his head. Anderson was a decent detective when Blair wasn't breathing down his neck, and he had worked with Hamish before. They had an understanding. "I'll start with the church records," Hamish said. "The Reverend may have left notes about his concerns." "You do that," Blair said dismissively, already reaching for his flask. "Just don't muck anything up." Mrs. Bell arrived within the hour, keys to the church jingling in her hand. She looked tired, dark circles under her eyes suggesting a sleepless night. "I've brought everything from the office," she said, producing a cardboard box filled with files. "Financial records, meeting minutes, the Reverend's appointment diary, whatever you need, Hamish." They worked in the vestry, a small room at the back of the church that smelled of old hymn books and furniture polish. Mrs. Bell had organised everything with her usual efficiency, explaining the filing system and pointing out which records were current and which were historical. "The Reverend spent a great deal of time with the old records," she said, gesturing to a pile of ledgers from years past. "He was very interested in donations from 5-6 years ago. I told him everything was above board, but he insisted on going through every entry." Hamish leafed through the ledgers, noting the careful handwriting that recorded christenings, marriages, funerals, and the weekly collections. Nothing immediately struck him as suspicious, but then he had never been much good with figures. That was more Jimmy Anderson's territory. Did the Reverend mention what he was looking for? Not specifically. He said something about irregularities, but when I asked him to elaborate, he just smiled and said he hoped he was wrong. Mrs. Bell's voice carried a hint of offence. "As if I would allow irregularities under my watch." It was while Mrs. Bell was making tea in the church kitchen that Hamish found the scrap of paper. It had fallen behind the Reverend's desk, wedged between the wall and the wooden leg. The paper was thick, expensive quality, torn roughly from a larger sheet. On it, drawn in black ink, was a 5-pointed star. Beneath the star, in what appeared to be a different hand, more hurried and less controlled, were the words, "I can't live with it any longer." Hamish stared at the paper, turning it over in his hands. Was it a confession, a suicide note? But Reverend Munro had been murdered, not a suicide. Perhaps it was something the Reverend had received from someone else, a parishioner unburdening their conscience. Or perhaps it was a threat. He slipped the paper into an evidence bag just as Mrs. Bell returned with the tea. "Find anything useful?" she asked, setting down the tray. "Maybe," Did the Reverend receive much correspondence? Oh, the usual. Church circulars, letters from parishioners, the occasional begging letter from charities. I sorted it all for him each morning. Did you notice anything unusual in the past week or so? Mrs. Bell frowned, thinking. There was one envelope without a return address. Hand-delivered, I assume, because it had no stamp. The Reverend took it into his office and closed the door. When he came out, he looked quite troubled. When was this? Thursday, 3 days before he died. Hamish made a note and continued his search, but found nothing else of significance. The Reverend's diary showed appointments with Angus Fraser, Morag Campbell, and Ewan Mackay, exactly as Mrs. Bell had mentioned. There were also several entries marked simply with initials, but Mrs. Bell couldn't identify who they referred to. After Mrs. Bell had left, Hamish walked through the church itself, lugs padding beside him. The decorations were half finished, the nativity scene that Mrs. Bell had been arranging still incomplete. The figures of Mary and Joseph stood in the stable, but the infant Jesus lay to one side, not yet placed in the manger. It gave the whole scene an air of waiting, of incompletion. He climbed the narrow stone stairs that led up to the tower, where the illuminated star had been mounted. The stairs were steep and dark, lit only by small windows set into the thick walls. At the top, a wooden door opened onto a small platform where the electrical equipment for the star was housed. The star itself extended from a metal framework bolted to the tower's highest point. The wiring was neat and professional, clearly the work of someone who knew what they were doing. Hamish examined it carefully, looking for any signs of tampering or damage. There were none. From this height he could see across the whole village. The loch gleamed grey under the overcast sky, and thin smoke rose from chimneys. It was peaceful, beautiful, in its bleakness, and utterly at odds with the violence that had occurred here. He was descending the stairs when he met Jessie Curry coming up, breathing heavily from the climb. "Hamish Macbeth, what are you doing up here?" "I might ask you the same thing, Jessie." She had the grace to look slightly abashed. "I wanted to see where it happened. Is that so terrible? He was my minister, after all." "The murder happened at the bottom of the front steps, not up here." "I know that. But he was up here first, wasn't he, checking the star? I just wanted to understand." She looked at him with bright, curious eyes. "Is it true someone hit him on the head before he fell? Who told you that?" "Oh, it's all over the village. Dr. Dalrymple's receptionist told her sister, who told Ian at the garage, who mentioned it to his wife, and she's in my book club." Hamish sighed. Village gossip travelled faster than light and was considerably more difficult to stop. "Jessie, did the Reverend ever talk to you about needing to make things right? About truth before Christmas?" She nodded vigorously. "He did, actually. It was after the service 2 Sundays ago. He said that Christmas was approaching and it was a time for clearing consciences, that people who had done wrong things, even small wrong things, should confess and make amends. I thought it was just sermon talk, you know how ministers go on, but he seemed very serious about it." "Did he mention anyone specific?" "Not names, but he said some people in the parish were carrying heavy burdens of guilt, and he intended to help them set those burdens down." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He said that even if it caused scandal, the truth was more important than keeping up appearances." After Jessie had left, disappointed at not being allowed to examine the murder scene more closely, Hamish stood in the cold church and considered what he had learned. The Reverend had been digging into the past, asking pointed questions, urging people toward confession. He had discovered something in the financial records that concerned him. He had received an anonymous note that troubled him deeply. And then someone had killed him, struck him down in the shadow of the Christmas star he had been so proud to erect. The scrap of paper with its cryptic message weighed heavy in Hamish's pocket. "I can't live with it any longer." Whose hand had written those words? And had they been meant as confession or warning? The church was silent around him, holding its secrets close. But Hamish Macbeth had dealt with secretive Highland villages before. Patience and persistence would eventually reveal the truth, though he suspected that truth would bring little comfort to Lochdoub this Christmas. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and somewhere in the village, a murderer went about their daily business, perhaps believing they had silenced the Reverend's questions forever. They were wrong. Chapter 4 whispers in the pew, Angus Fraser lived in a solid stone house on the outskirts of Lochdoub, the sort of house that spoke of old money carefully preserved through generations of Presbyterian thrift. He was a man in his 60s with the weathered face of someone who had spent years farming before selling his land at a tidy profit and retiring to a life of respectability in church committees. He did not look pleased to see Hamish on his doorstep. "I've already spoken to that Glasgow detective," Angus said, his accent thick with disapproval. "Rude man. Smelled of drink at 10 in the morning. Well, I'm just tying up loose ends," Hamish said in his most apologetic manner. "Won't take but a few minutes of your time." Angus grudgingly admitted him to a sitting room that was painfully neat, every surface polished to within an inch of its life. The furniture was expensive but uncomfortable, chosen for show rather than comfort. A portrait of John Knox glowered down from above the fireplace. "You a church elder for how long?" Hamish asked, settling into a chair that felt as welcoming as a granite boulder. 15 years. Since old Reverend Macpherson appointed me, I take my duties seriously, always have." "You disagreed with Reverend Munro's plan to audit the finances?" Angus's face darkened. "It was an insult. Those books have been kept honestly for decades. My father was treasurer before me and his father before him. To suggest there might be irregularities was to question the integrity of this entire family." "The Reverend didn't actually accuse you of wrongdoing, though, did he? He implied it, said times had changed, that modern church governance required transparency and oversight." "Transparency!" Angus spat the word. "As if we'd been hiding something all these years. When did you last see Reverend Munro?" "The evening he died. We had words in the church hall around 6 o'clock. I told him that if he pursued this audit business, I would resign my position. He said that was my choice to make, but the audit would proceed regardless." "How did you part?" "Angrily, I won't deny it. But I went straight home afterward, and my wife can confirm it. We had supper together, watched the television, and went to bed at 10. I had nothing to do with his death." Hamish made notes in his deliberate way, giving no indication of whether he believed the man or not. "Did Reverend Munro say what specifically concerned him? About the finances?" Angus hesitated, and in that hesitation Hamish saw something flicker across his face, or uncertainty perhaps, or the first stirrings of doubt. He mentioned discrepancies in the donation records from 5 or 6 years ago. Small amounts, he said, but consistent, as if someone had been taking a little here and there over time. Angus's voice had lost some of its bluster. "I told him he was imagining things, that the books balanced perfectly well, but he said the numbers didn't lie." "And do they? Lie, I mean?" "I don't know." The admission seemed to pain him. "I haven't kept the books myself for 3 years now. That duty passed to Mrs. Bell when my arthritis made the writing difficult. If there are irregularities, I knew nothing about them." After leaving Angus Fraser's house, Hamish drove to the council estate where Morag Campbell lived in a small tidy bungalow. She was a woman in her early 50s, thin and nervous, with hands that picked constantly at the hem of her cardigan. She offered him tea with the automatic hospitality of the Highlands, but her movements were jerky and agitated. Hamish accepted, knowing that the ritual would calm her somewhat. "I didn't kill him," she said, before Hamish had even asked a question. "I know everyone will think I did because of what he said about Duncan, but I didn't." "What did he say about Duncan?" Hamish asked gently. Duncan Campbell had been Morag's husband, dead these 5 years from what had been ruled an accidental fall from the cliffs near the loch. Morag's eyes filled with tears. "He said it wasn't an accident. He said Duncan had been despondent, drinking heavily, and that I must have known he was considering taking his own life. He wanted me to admit that Duncan had killed himself so the church could address it properly, as a pastoral matter." "And had he? Killed himself?" "I don't know." The words burst from her in a wail of anguish. "I've asked myself that question every day for 5 years. Duncan was troubled, He'd lost his job, we were behind on the mortgage, and he felt he'd failed as husband and provider. But he never spoke of ending his life. Never. Why would Reverend Munro bring this up now? Morag wiped her eyes with a tissue. He said the church had a responsibility to truth, that there were too many things in Lochdub swept under the carpet, too many convenient stories accepted without question. He wanted to set the record straight. Where were you on the evening he died? At choir practice. We were rehearsing carols for the Christmas service. Mrs. Henderson leads the choir, and we practice in the church hall every Tuesday evening from 7 until 8:30. There were a dozen of us there. Did you see the Reverend that evening? Only briefly. He poked his head into the hall around 7 to tell us we were sounding wonderful. Then he said he had to check on the star and disappeared. That was the last I saw of him. Hamish's third interview of the day was with Ewan Mackay, the church caretaker, who lived above the hardware shop in the village centre. Ewan was a bachelor in his 40s, a quiet man who had always struck Hamish as competent if unambitious. He met Hamish at the door with a wary expression, clearly expecting interrogation. Men in then. Mind the tools. I'm in the middle of a repair job. The flat was cluttered but clean, filled with the organised chaos of a man who worked with his hands. Tools hung neatly on pegboards, and a workbench dominated one corner of the small sitting room. Mrs. Bell mentioned you had a disagreement with Reverend Munro, Hamish began. Ewan snorted. Disagreement is putting it mildly. He threatened to sack me, said the church grounds were looking shabby, and the heating system wasn't being maintained properly. Never mind that I've been doing this job for 10 years without a single complaint from Reverend Macpherson. What did you say to that? I told him I did my job as well as could be expected given the pittance they pay me, and the lack of proper equipment. The heating system is ancient, held together with prayer and duct tape. The grounds look shabby because there's no budget for landscaping, but he didn't want to hear excuses, he said. Just results. When did this conversation take place? Last Tuesday. He called me into the vestry and gave me a formal warning. Said if things didn't improve by Christmas, he'd be recommending my dismissal to the church board. You must have been angry. Furious, Ewan admitted, but not angry enough to kill the man. I was outside the church hall on Tuesday evening fixing those blasted Christmas lights that kept shorting out. Ask anyone who came to choir practice. They all saw me up a ladder wrestling with the wiring. Hamish walked back to the police station through the falling snow, lugs trotting at his heels. 3 suspects, each with a motive, and each with what appeared to be a solid alibi. Angus had been home with his wife. Morag had been at choir practice with witnesses. Ewan had been repairing lights in full view of multiple parishioners. Yet one of them might be lying, or perhaps their alibi wasn't as solid as it seemed. Or perhaps the killer was someone else entirely, someone he hadn't yet considered. Back at the station, he found Mrs. Bell waiting for him, a folder of papers in her hand. I've been thinking about what you asked, she said. About the Reverend's appointments. I went through his diary more carefully and made a list of everyone he met with privately over the past month. She handed him the folder, and Hamish scanned the neat list. Along with the 3 suspects he had just interviewed, there were 4 other names, but it was Mrs. Bell's organisational notes that caught his attention. You've marked the dates and times of each appointment. Yes, I thought it might help establish a timeline. You'll notice that Angus Fraser met with him at 6 on Tuesday evening. Morag Campbell was seen by him on Monday afternoon, and Ewan Mackay's warning was issued on Tuesday morning. Very thorough, Hamish said, studying her face. She met his gaze steadily, her expression helpful and open. Too helpful, perhaps. Too eager to provide information about everyone's movements, everyone's grudges, everyone's access to the church and the Reverend. Mrs. Bell, he said slowly, how long have you been church secretary? 5 years, since just after Duncan Campbell died. And before that? I was living in Strathbane working for St. Andrew's Parish there. Why did you leave? For the first time, something flickered across Mrs. Bell's face. It was gone in an instant, smoothed over by her usual competent calm, but Hamish had seen it. Discomfort, or perhaps worry. Personal reasons, she said. I wanted a quieter life, and the position here came available. Seemed like providence. She left shortly after, and Hamish sat at his desk staring at the list of names. 3 suspects with motives and alibis. A helpful church secretary who seemed to know everyone's business. A dead minister who'd been determined to uncover truth at any cost. And somewhere in this tangle of information lay the answer to who had struck down Reverend Munro beneath the Christmas star. Hamish picked up the phone. It was time to call Strathbane and find out exactly why Catriona Bell had left her previous parish in such a hurry. Chapter 5, Sins Beneath the Tinsel. Jimmy Anderson arrived at the police station early the next morning, looking slightly dishevelled and carrying 2 cups of coffee from the Italian restaurant. "Blair's nursing a hangover and won't surface until noon," he said, handing 1 cup to Hamish. "Thought we might actually get some work done while he's incapacitated." "You're a good man, Jimmy." "Don't let it get around. I've got a reputation to maintain." Anderson settled into the chair opposite Hamish's desk and pulled out his notebook. "I've been going through those financial records you sent over. Interesting reading." "Find something?" "Aye. Small discrepancies like Angus Fraser mentioned. Nothing huge. A few pounds here and there, but consistent over about 3 years. Started roughly 6 years ago and stopped suddenly 5 years back." Hamish felt a stirring of interest. Around the time Duncan Campbell died, and around the time Mrs. Bell took over as church secretary. Anderson tapped his pen against the notebook. "The irregularities are subtle. Donation amounts that don't quite match up with the bank deposits. Collection totals that seem suspiciously round. The sort of thing you'd only notice if you were looking for it, or if you were very good with numbers. Which Reverend Munro apparently was. His degree was in accounting before he went into the ministry. Did you know that?" Hamish hadn't, but it explained the Reverend's interest in the church finances. A man trained to spot financial irregularities would have noticed the patterns immediately. "Though someone was skimming from the collection," Hamish said. "Not much, but regular. And then it stopped. Either they got scared, or they got what they needed, or something else changed." Anderson took a long drink of his coffee. "The question is, who had access to the money and the books?" "Angus Fraser as treasurer, up until 3 years ago when his arthritis got bad. Mrs. Bell took over the day-to-day bookkeeping 5 years ago, and before that old Mrs. MacLeod kept the books until she died." "Convenient death?" "Natural causes, according to Dr. Brodie, who was the village doctor before Dr. Dalrymple. Heart failure at 83. I checked the records this morning." Anderson grinned. "You've been busy. Blair thinks you're lazy. But I know better. Don't disabuse him of the notion. It's useful." The phone on Hamish's desk rang. It was the records office in Strathbane returning his inquiry about Mrs. Bell's previous employment. "There's not much on file," the clerk said. "She worked at St. Andrews for 8 years. Left of her own accord 5 years ago. References were satisfactory. No complaints on record." "What about the priest she worked for?" "Father Michael O'Brien. Retired shortly after Mrs. Bell left, moved to Ireland. Died there. About 3 years ago." "Any scandal associated with his retirement?" There was a pause. "Nothing official, but I remember the gossip at the time. There were whispers about money going missing from the parish fund. Nothing was ever proven, and Father O'Brien went quietly. The diocese didn't want a fuss." Hamish thanked the clerk and rang off, his mind working. Mrs. Bell had been at St. Andrews when money went missing. She had come to Loughdub and taken over the financial duties. The irregularities had stopped around the time Duncan Campbell died. What was the connection? "I need to speak to Morag Campbell again," he said to Anderson. "Something she said yesterday is nagging at me." They found Morag in her garden, half-heartedly tidying the flower beds despite the cold. She looked up at their approach with resignation. "More questions?" "Just 1 or 2, Mrs. Campbell. Your husband lost his job before he died. Where was he working?" "At the council offices in Strathbane. He was an accountant there for 15 years until they made redundancies. Duncan took it hard. He was proud of his work." "Did he know Mrs. Bell before she came to Loughdub?" Morag frowned, thinking. I don't think so. Why do you ask? Just trying to establish connections. Did your husband ever mention anything unusual about the church finances? Duncan didn't have much to do with the church. He'd lost his faith along with his job, he used to say. Her voice caught. Why are you asking about this? What does it have to do with Duncan's death? Maybe nothing, Hamish said gently, but Reverend Munro seemed to think there was something suspicious about it. After they left, Anderson said, You think Duncan Campbell discovered the financial irregularities? He was an accountant out of work. Maybe he volunteered to help with the church books, saw something wrong, and confronted whoever was responsible. And was killed for it? Or killed himself because he couldn't prove it, or because he was being blackmailed. Hamish stared out at the grey loch. Either way, it would explain why Reverend Munro was asking questions about his death. Back at the police station, they found Angus Fraser waiting for them, his face grim. I've been going through the old records, he said without preamble, the ones from when I was still treasurer. You were right to ask questions. There are discrepancies I never noticed before. He spread papers across Hamish's desk, pointing to columns of numbers with a shaking finger. Here, and here, and here. The weekly collection amounts don't match what was deposited. Small differences, but they add up. Over the 3 years in question, nearly £2,000 unaccounted for. When did you stop keeping the books yourself? Hamish asked. I handed most of the day-to-day work to Mrs. Bell about 5 years ago, when my arthritis made writing difficult. But I still reviewed the monthly summaries until 3 years ago, when I stepped down as treasurer completely. I trusted her to maintain the standards I'd set. His voice was bitter. I was a fool. Did you mention any of this to Reverend Munro? I hadn't noticed it until he started asking his questions, but once he pointed me toward those particular years, the pattern became obvious. £2,000 stolen from church collections. It's not the amount that bothers me so much as the betrayal of trust. After Angus left, Hamish sat quietly piecing together the picture. Mrs. Bell had come from a parish where money had gone missing. She had taken over the financial duties in Lochdup, and more money had gone missing. Duncan Campbell, an unemployed accountant, might have noticed and either been killed or driven to suicide. The irregularities had stopped after his death, suggesting either fear or achievement of some financial goal. Then Reverend Munro had arrived with his accountant's eye and his passion for truth, and he had started asking questions. And someone had killed him to prevent those questions from being answered. The evidence pointed increasingly toward Mrs. Bell, but Hamish was troubled. She had been helpful to a fault, providing information freely, granting access to everything. Would a guilty person behave that way? Or was it the behaviour of someone so confident in their innocence that they had nothing to hide? Or perhaps the behaviour of someone so used to being helpful that it had become second nature, a shield behind which darker activities could be concealed. I need to talk to her, Hamish said to Anderson, but carefully. If she is guilty, I don't want to spook her into running. Blair will want to bring her in for formal questioning. Blair can wait until we have something concrete. Hamish reached for his jacket. Right now, I want to search her house. Do you have a warrant? I have probable cause, and the knowledge that she's currently at the church, preparing for the funeral arrangements. That gives us perhaps an hour. Anderson grinned. You're a devious man, Hamish Macbeth. I prefer thorough. Mrs. Bell's cottage was neat as a pin, everything in its place, nothing to suggest criminality or guilt. But Hamish had learned over the years that the most organised people often had the most to hide. It was in the bedroom, in a locked drawer of her desk, that he found what he was looking for. Bank statements showing regular deposits over 3 years, amounts that roughly corresponded to the missing church funds. The deposits had stopped 5 years ago. There was also a bundle of letters tied with string addressed to Father O'Brien. Hamish read one and felt his blood run cold. The letter was from Mrs. Bell begging Father O'Brien not to report her to the authorities. She had only borrowed the money, she wrote, to help her sister through a medical crisis. She would pay it back, every penny, if he would just give her time. Medical crisis, Anderson said over Hamish's shoulder. That's often how it starts. A genuine emergency, then the habit forms. Except she never paid it back. She came here instead, started again and stopped only when Duncan Campbell noticed. So she killed Campbell. Or he killed himself when she threatened him with exposure of what he'd discovered. Either way, his death solved her problem. Until Reverend Monroe started digging. Hamish looked around the tidy cottage, at the carefully maintained respectability, and felt a wave of sadness. Here was a woman who had let a moment of weakness turn into years of theft, who had destroyed lives to protect her secret, and who would now face justice for murder. "We need to confront her," he said, "but not here, and not with Blair breathing down our necks, somewhere she feels safe, where she might tell the truth. The church? Aye, the church, where all of this began and where it needs to end." Outside, the snow had stopped, and the winter sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the white village. Christmas was only days away, but for Mrs. Catriona Bell, there would be no celebration this year, only the reckoning she had tried so desperately to avoid. Chapter 6. False Erdars. Hamish sat in his police station that evening, the evidence spread before him like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that refused to form a complete picture. The bank statements, the letters, the financial records, all pointed unmistakably toward Mrs. Bell. Yet something nagged at him, some detail that didn't quite fit. Luggs raised his head from his position by the fire and whined softly. I know," Hamish said to the dog. "It's too neat, isn't it?" Jimmy Anderson had returned to Strathbane to file his report, promising to keep Blair occupied with paperwork while Hamish followed his instincts. Those instincts were telling him to slow down, to look more carefully at what appeared to be an open and shut case. He pulled out his notebook and began reviewing the timelines. Reverend Monroe had been killed between 7 and 8 o'clock on Tuesday evening. Mrs. Bell claimed she had been decorating the church and heard the Reverend cry out as he fell. She had discovered the body around 8:30. But what about the 3 other suspects? Hamish reached for the phone and called Mrs. Henderson, the choir director. "Mrs. Henderson, it's Hamish Macbeth. Quick question about Tuesday evening's choir practice." "Oh, Hamish, terrible business about the Reverend. We're all quite shaken." "I understand. Can you tell me what time Morag Campbell arrived at practice?" "Let me think. We start promptly at 7, and Morag is always early. She helps me set out the music stands. I'd say she arrived at 7:15, perhaps a bit earlier." "And she stayed the entire practice?" "Until 8:30 when we finished. She's my most reliable soprano, never misses a note or a rehearsal." Hamish thanked her and rang off. So Morag Campbell had an alibi that held firm. Next, he called the various choir members who had been present, asking casually about the lights outside the church hall. Each one confirmed that Ewan Mackay had been up a ladder, wrestling with faulty wiring visible to anyone coming or going. He had been there when they arrived at 7, and was still there when they left at 8:30, cursing the lights and the cold in equal measure. Ewan Mackay's alibi was solid. Finally, Hamish drove out to Angus Fraser's house, where he found the man's wife, Margaret, a formidable woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for honesty. "Mrs. Fraser, I apologise for the late hour. Just confirming a few details. Your husband was home with you on Tuesday evening?" "From 6:30 until bedtime. We had lamb stew for supper, watched that quiz programme he likes, and were in bed by 10. He never left the house." "You're certain?" "Young man, I've been married to Angus for 40 years. I know when he's in the house and when he's not. He was here, brooding about that audit business, but definitely here." Hamish drove back through the dark village, his mind churning. 3 suspects, 3 solid alibis. The evidence pointed to Mrs. Bell, but she too had an apparent alibi. She had been in the church decorating, had heard the Reverend fall, had discovered the body, unless she was lying. But if she was lying, why had she called for help immediately? Why not simply leave and let someone else find the body? Why be the one to report it, knowing that would make her a suspect? He found himself driving to the church without quite meaning to, drawn by the lit windows of the vestry where Mrs. Bell was working late, organising the funeral service that would take place once the police released the body. Her small car sat in the car park, snow gathering on its windscreen. Hamish sat in his Land Rover for a moment, watching the windows. Then he saw something that made him sit up straight. Another figure moved past the vestry window, too tall and broad to be Mrs. Bell. Someone else was in the church with her. He was out of the vehicle and moving toward the church entrance before he had consciously decided to do so. The door was unlocked, and he slipped inside quietly. Voices drifted from the vestry, raised in argument. "I know what you did." It was Angus Fraser's voice, tight with anger. "I've worked it out. You were skimming money for years, and when Duncan Campbell discovered it, you drove him to his death." "That's absurd." Mrs. Bell's voice was calm but strained. Mr. Fraser, you're upset about the sordid findings, but that doesn't give you the right to make wild accusations." "Wild? I have the bank records. I've seen where the money went. Small amounts, careful but consistent. You stole from the church, from God himself." Hamish moved closer to the vestry door, keeping to the shadows. "Even if that were true," Mrs. Bell said, her voice dropping, "it has nothing to do with the Reverend's death. I was here in the church when he fell. I called for help immediately." "Were you, though? Or did you follow him up those steps, strike him down when his back was turned, and then come running with your story about hearing a cry?" "I think you should leave, Mr. Fraser. You're distraught." "I'll leave when I'm ready. First, I want the truth. Did you kill Reverend Munro to stop him exposing you?" Hamish stepped into the doorway. "That's enough, Angus!" Both of them turned, startled. Mrs. Bell's face was pale, her hands clasped tightly together. Angus Fraser looked flushed, his breathing rapid. "She's guilty, Hamish. The evidence is clear." "The evidence is circumstantial," Hamish said calmly, "and you shouldn't be here confronting a potential suspect on your own. I have a right to know the truth. This is my church, my family's church. Go home, Angus. Let me do my job." After a long moment, Fraser nodded stiffly and left, his footsteps echoing through the empty church. Hamish waited until he heard the outer door close before turning to Mrs. Bell. "You should have told me about the money," he said quietly. She sank into a chair, her composure finally cracking. "I know, but I was so ashamed. It started with my sister's illness, just as I wrote in those letters you found. I meant to pay it back, truly I did, but then there was never enough, and it became a habit I couldn't break." "And Duncan Campbell?" Tears spilled down her cheeks. "He came to me one day, showed me what he'd found in the books. He was so kind about it, said he understood how these things could happen. He offered to help me make it right, to set up a repayment plan that no one else need know about. But I couldn't face it. The shame, the scrutiny. I told him I needed time to think. The next day he were dead. They said he'd fallen from the cliffs, but I've always wondered if my refusal, my cowardice, drove him to it." "And Reverend Munro discovered the same thing?" "Yes. He was clever with numbers, saw the patterns immediately. He said it had to be made right publicly before Christmas. That truth mattered more than my reputation or the church's standing." She looked up at Hamish with red-rimmed eyes. "But I didn't kill him. I swear on everything I hold sacred, I did not kill him." Hamish studied her face, the genuine anguish there, and believed her. This was a woman racked with guilt over theft and Duncan Campbell's death, but not the guilt of murder. "Tell me exactly what happened Tuesday evening, every detail." Mrs. Bell wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath. "I was arranging the nativity scene, as I told you. The Reverend said he wanted to check the star one last time. He went outside and I heard his footsteps on the stone. Then, perhaps 10 minutes later, I heard a cry and a terrible crash. When I got outside, he was lying at the bottom of the steps." 10 minutes, Hamish said thoughtfully. "That's a long time to check a star that was already working properly." "I suppose so. I didn't think about it at the time." "And you saw no one else? Heard nothing unusual before the cry?" "Nothing. The church was silent except for my movements and the wind outside." After Mrs. Bell had gone, escorted home by a female constable Anderson had sent over, Hamish stood in the empty church and thought. 3 suspects with solid alibis. A church secretary guilty of theft, but not, he believed, of murder. Dead minister who'd spent 10 minutes doing something before he was killed. What had Reverend Munro been doing in those 10 minutes? Checking the star didn't require that much time. Had he been meeting someone? Confronting someone? Hamish climbed the tower stairs again, his torch beam cutting through the darkness. At the top he examined the platform more carefully than he had before, and there, caught on a rough piece of metal, he found a few threads of dark wool. Someone had been up here recently. Someone wearing a dark woolen garment. Someone who had met with Reverend Munro on the tower platform before striking him down. But who? All 3 suspects had been accounted for, unless their alibis weren't as solid as they appeared, or unless there was someone else he hadn't considered. Hamish stood on the platform, looking out over Loch Dubh, and finally admitted to himself what his instincts had been telling him all along. He'd been looking at this case the wrong way from the start. Chapter 7. The Faithful Secretary. The next morning dawned clear and bitterly cold, the kind of Highland winter day where the air itself seemed to crystallise. Hamish stood in his kitchen making breakfast for Lugs and himself, his mind worrying at the problem of Mrs. Bell like a dog with a particularly stubborn bone. She had been too helpful from the beginning, providing information, granting access, pointing him towards suspects. At first he had thought this was the behaviour of someone with nothing to hide. Then he'd believed it was the arrogance of a criminal who thought herself too clever to be caught. Now he wondered if it was something else entirely. What if Mrs. Bell hadn't been directing his attention to distract him from her own guilt, but rather to protect someone else? The telephone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Jimmy Anderson, calling from Strathbane. "I've been digging into Mrs. Bell's history," Anderson said. "Thought you might want to know what I found." "Go on." Before St Andrews in Strathbane, she worked at a parish in Inverness, and before that one in Aberdeen. Same story at both places, exemplary service, then sudden departure. No scandal on record, but I called around, spoke to people who were there. Rumours of financial irregularities at both parishes. "She's been doing this for years," Hamish said. "Aye, but here's the interesting bit. At each parish there was a death shortly before she left. In Aberdeen, an elderly priest died of a heart attack. In Inverness, a deacon fell downstairs and broke his neck, both ruled accidental." Hamish felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Highland winter. That's too many coincidences. That's what I thought, so I did some more digging. The priest in Aberdeen had been conducting a review of parish finances just before he died. The deacon in Inverness had discovered irregularities in the donation records, and both died before they could make their findings public. Exactly. Mrs. Bell stayed on for a few months after each death, then moved to a new parish. Rinse and repeat. After Anderson rang off, Hamish sat in silence, staring at the winter light streaming through his window. Mrs. Bell was not just a thief. She was a serial killer who had been murdering priests and church officials for years, anyone who got too close to discovering her crimes. Except his instincts told him that wasn't right either. The woman he had spoken to last night had been genuinely distraught about Duncan Campbell's death, genuinely ashamed of her theft. Could she have been acting? Perhaps, but Hamish had spent years reading people, and everything in him to have said that Mrs. Bell's anguish had been real. So if she hadn't killed those men, who had? He needed more information about Mrs. Bell's past, about the parishes where she had worked. He needed to understand the pattern, not just of the thefts, but of the deaths that had followed. An hour later, he was driving through the snowy countryside toward Inverness, Lugs beside him in the passenger seat. The dog seemed to sense his mood and sat quietly, only occasionally pressing his nose against the window to watch the landscape roll past. The Church of the Holy Cross in Inverness was a modern building, all glass and clean lines, very different from the ancient stone kirk in Loch Dubh. The current priest, Father McNeill, was a young man with an open face and a firm handshake. "I remember Mrs. Bell," he said when Hamish explained his purpose. "She left about 8 years ago before I arrived, but her reputation lingered. Very efficient, very organised. Parishioners spoke highly of her. And Deacon Fraser, the man who died. Father McNeil's expression grew sombre. That was a tragedy. He fell down the church stairs late one evening. No witnesses, but the stairs were known to be slippery when wet. Was there anyone else in the church that night? Mrs. Bell found him the next morning when she arrived to open up. She was quite shaken by it, apparently. The same pattern, Hamish thought. Mrs. Bell finding the body, being helpful, providing information. Did Deacon Fraser have family? A sister, Margaret Fraser. She still lives in Inverness, if you want to speak with her. Margaret Fraser lived in a small terraced house near the city centre. She was a woman in her 60s with grey hair and sad eyes that brightened with suspicion when Hamish introduced himself. "You're asking about Robert's death after all these years?" "I'm investigating a similar case, a minister who died after discovering financial irregularities. I understand your brother had found something similar." "He had." Margaret's voice was bitter. "He told me someone had been stealing from the parish collection. Small amounts, but regular. He was going to report it to the bishop, but before he could, he had his accident." "Did he tell you who he suspected?" "He never got the chance. But I always wondered about that secretary, Mrs. Bell. She was the one who had access to everything, the one who kept the books, and she was the one who found him. Convenient, don't you think?" "Did you share your suspicions with the police?" "I tried. They said there was no evidence of foul play. Robert had a history of high blood pressure, they said. He might have felt dizzy, lost his balance. They wanted it to be an accident, so it was an accident." She leaned forward. "But I never believed it. My brother was murdered to keep him quiet." "By Mrs. Bell?" Margaret hesitated. "I don't know. There was someone else, someone Robert mentioned in passing. He said Mrs. Bell wasn't working alone, that someone was protecting her, but he died before he could tell me who." Hamish drove back to Loch Dubh through the gathering dusk, his mind racing. Mrs. Bell had an accomplice, someone who had been protecting her across multiple parishes, someone who killed to keep her secrets safe, someone she cared enough about to cover for, to direct suspicion away from, someone she would rather go to prison herself than betray. Back at the police station, he found a message from Jimmy Anderson. More information had come to light about the priest who had died in Aberdeen. Father Thomas Bell, the same surname as Mrs. Catriona Bell. Hamish felt the pieces clicking into place. He pulled out the file of photographs from the church, pictures taken at various parish events over the past 5 years. There, in several shots, standing beside Mrs. Bell at fundraisers and Christmas services, was a familiar figure. He picked up the phone and called Anderson. "Jimmy, I need you to check something for me, find out if Mrs. Bell has any children, particularly a son." 20 minutes later, Anderson called back. "She has a son, Thomas Bell Jr., named after his father, who was a priest in Aberdeen. The father died 15 years ago when Thomas Jr. was just 18. Natural causes, apparently, though there were whispers about depression and drink." "Where is Thomas Jr. now?" "That's the interesting part. He moved to Inverness 8 years ago, then to Strathbane 5 years ago, and currently lives in Loch Dubh. Works as a freelance electrician." The electrician who had installed the lighting for the Christmas star. The electrician who would have had every reason to be in the church tower on Tuesday evening checking his work. Hamish felt the final piece fall into place. Mrs. Bell hadn't been protecting herself. She'd been protecting her son, the boy who had grown up watching his mother struggle after his father's death. The young man who had taken it upon himself to clean up her messes, to eliminate anyone who threatened to expose her. Thomas Bell Jr. had been killing for his mother for years, following her from parish to parish, watching for anyone who got too close to the truth. And when Reverend Munro had started asking questions, when he had discovered the financial irregularities and demanded public confession, Thomas had acted again. But how to prove it? Thomas Bell would have been careful, would have left no evidence. Mrs. Bell herself might not even fully realise what her son had been doing, might have convinced herself that the deaths were genuinely accidental, coincidences that happened to solve her problems. Hamish needed to make Thomas Bell reveal himself, and he knew exactly how to do it. He reached for the phone and called Mrs. Bell. "I need you to meet me at the church," he said. "There's something important we need to discuss about the case, something about your son." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Mrs. Bell spoke, her voice was hollow. "You know." "I know enough. Will you help me, Mrs. Bell? Will you help me stop him before he kills again?" Another silence, longer this time. Then so quietly he almost missed it. "Yes." Hamish hung up and looked at Luggs. "Come on, boy. It's time to catch a murderer." Outside, the Christmassy star blazed against the darkening sky, a beacon of light over a village that harboured deadly secrets. But tonight, Hamish thought, those secrets would finally be brought into the open. Tonight, beneath that star, the truth would be revealed at last. Chapter 8. The Light Reveals the Shadow. The church was dark when Hamish arrived, only the glow from the tower star casting its pale light across the snow-covered grounds. He had asked Jimmy Anderson to wait outside with 2 constables from Strathbane, close enough to respond but far enough not to spook Thomas Bell if he appeared. Mrs. Bell was already there, sitting in a front pew with her hands folded in her lap. She looked smaller somehow, diminished, as if the weight of what she knew had physically compressed her. "He doesn't know I'm helping you," she said as Hamish slid into the pew beside her. "He thinks I called him here to warn him, to tell him you're getting close." "When did you realise what he'd been doing?" Her hands twisted together, the only sign of her agitation. "I didn't. Not for years. I convinced myself they were accidents, all of them. Father O'Brien's heart attack, Deacon Fraser's fall, even poor Duncan Campbell. I told myself it was coincidence, that God was protecting me from exposure because deep down I was a good person who had just made mistakes. But you knew about Reverend Munro." "Not immediately," her voice cracked. "Thomas came to see me the morning after it happened. He was agitated, kept asking if the police suspected anything. That's when I started to understand. And when you found those threads on the tower platform, when you started asking about electricians, I knew for certain. Why didn't you come forward?" "He's my son." The words were simple but carried the weight of a mother's love and anguish. After his father died, he became everything to me. When I made my mistakes, when I started taking the money, he found out somehow. He said he'd take care of it, that he'd protect me. I thought he meant he'd help me pay it back. I never imagined—" She broke off, pressing a hand to her mouth. "Tell me what happened with Reverend Munro." Mrs. Bell took a shaky breath. Thomas had installed the star's lighting. He knew the Reverend was concerned about the wiring, that he checked it obsessively. Thomas told him there might be a problem, asked him to come up to the tower that Tuesday evening so they could inspect it together. Once they were up there, Thomas confronted him about the investigation into the finances. He tried to convince the Reverend to drop it, to let me repay the money quietly without scandal. And when Reverend Munro refused, Thomas struck him. He said it was impulse, that he never meant to kill him, but then he panicked and pushed the body down the steps to make it look like an accident. Tears streamed down her face. "My son is a murderer, multiple times over, and it's all because of me, because of my weakness and my theft." The church door opened, admitting a gust of cold air and Thomas Bell. He was a man in his early 30s, average height and build, with his mother's dark eyes and a face that would be easily forgotten in a crowd, the perfect face for someone who needed to disappear after committing murder. "Mum?" He saw Hamish and froze. "What's he doing here?" "Sit down, Thomas," Mrs. Bell said, her voice steadier than Hamish would have expected. "It's time to stop running." Thomas's hand went to his pocket and Hamish tensed, but the young man only pulled out his mobile phone, looked at it, then put it away again. He walked slowly up the aisle and stood facing them, his expression a mixture of defiance and fear. "You don't understand," he said to his mother. "I did it for you. Everything I did was to protect you. I never asked you to kill anyone. You didn't have to ask. They were going to destroy you, expose you, put you in prison. What kind of son would I be if I let that happen?" Hamish spoke quietly. How did it start, Thomas? Was it really Father O'Brien in Aberdeen? Thomas's jaw tightened. He was going to report her, my own father's colleague, someone who had known our family for years. He was going to turn her over to the police for what amounted to a few £1,000s, money she only took because we were desperate after Dad died. So you made his heart attack a reality. Digitalis in his evening tea, simple, untraceable, especially in a man with heart problems. Thomas spoke with eerie calm as if discussing a repair job rather than murder. He died peacefully in his sleep and Mum was safe. Until the next parish, where Deacon Fraser discovered the same thing. Fraser was a busybody who should have minded his own business. The stairs were dark, he'd had wine with dinner. It wasn't difficult to give him a push. Mrs. Bell made a small sound of distress, but Thomas continued, his voice taking on an edge of desperation. Don't you see, I had to protect you. You're all I have left. After Dad died, everything fell apart. Our finances, our standing in the community, our whole life. You made mistakes because you were trying to hold things together. I wasn't going to let sanctimonious priests punish you for that. And Duncan Campbell? Hamish asked. Campbell was different. Thomas's expression darkened. He was kind about it, offered to help Mum make restitution. That almost made it harder, but he would have talked eventually once his conscience got the better of him. So I followed him to the cliffs one evening, confronted him about threatening my mother. We struggled. He fell. Another accident. That you engineered. That I made necessary. Thomas looked at his mother, his eyes pleading. They were going to take you away from me. I couldn't let that happen. And Reverend Munro? Hamish kept his voice level, aware that Thomas was becoming increasingly agitated. Munro was the worst of them all. Self-righteous, demanding public confession, talking about truth and redemption as if those things mattered more than people's lives. I tried to reason with him up on that tower. Told him Mum would pay back every penny, that there was no need for scandal, but he wouldn't listen. Said the church had to be honest, that covering up sin was worse than the sin itself. So you hit him. I had a wrench in my pocket. I was supposed to be checking the wiring. Thomas's hands clenched into fists. He turned away from me, started down the stairs. I didn't plan it, but suddenly the wrench was in my hand and I was striking him. Then he was falling, tumbling down those steps, and it was too late to take it back. Thomas, Mrs. Bell whispered. Oh, Thomas, what have you done? What I had to do. He turned to Hamish, his expression hardening. But you won't prove any of it. There's no evidence connecting me to any of those deaths. It's just theories and suspicions. There are the wool threads from your jumper on the tower platform, Hamish said, and Dr. Dalrymple has preserved evidence from under Reverend Munro's fingernails. Skin cells, most likely from when he tried to defend himself. DNA evidence is quite conclusive these days. It was a bluff. Dr. Dalrymple had found nothing under the Reverend's nails. But Thomas didn't know that. The colour drained from Thomas's face. No, he didn't struggle, it was over too quickly. Then you've nothing to worry about, have you? Hamish stood slowly, his hand moving to his radio. But I think we should sort this out at the police station, don't you? Get everything on record. Thomas looked from Hamish to his mother, realisation dawning. You set me up. You brought him here, told him everything, your own son. I had to stop you, Mrs. Bell said, tears flowing freely now. I couldn't let you kill again. I couldn't carry that weight any more. For a moment Thomas seemed to crumple, the defiance leaving him. Then, with sudden violence, he turned and ran for the door. Hamish was after him immediately, but Thomas had youth and desperation on his side. He burst through the door and out into the snow, heading for the church tower stairs. Jimmy, he's running! Hamish shouted into his radio. Block the exits! But Thomas wasn't trying to escape. He was climbing the tower stairs, taking them two at a time, his footsteps echoing in the narrow space. Hamish followed, lugs barking frantically at the bottom. At the top, on the platform beneath the blazing star, Thomas stood at the edge, breathing heavily. Below, the ground was hard and unforgiving, covered in snow that sparkled in the starlight. Don't do it, lad, Hamish said, approaching carefully. Whatever you've done, This isn't the answer. Isn't it? Thomas laughed bitterly. I've killed 4 people. There's no coming back from that. And I've destroyed my mother, the one person I was trying to protect. Your mother needs you alive, Thomas. She needs to understand why you did what you did. She needs to forgive you, and you need to forgive yourself. Some things can't be forgiven. In my experience, there's precious little that can't be forgiven if people are willing to try. Hamish extended his hand. Come down from there. Face what you've done like a man. Thomas looked at the hand, then at the ground far below, then back at Hamish. For a long moment he wavered on the edge. Then slowly he stepped back and took Hamish's hand. I'm sorry, he whispered. God help me, I'm sorry. Below, in the church, Mrs. Bell sat alone in the pew and wept for her son, for the men he had killed, and for the terrible price of her own sins. Chapter 9. A Confession at Christmas. The arrest of Thomas Bell sent shockwaves through Lochdub, though the full details were kept quiet for the moment. Detective Chief Inspector Blair arrived from Strathbane in a foul mood, furious that Hamish had solved the case without him, and unable to take credit for the collar. You should have waited for proper backup, Blair blustered in the church hall, his face red with more than just the cold. Could have gotten yourself killed, confronting a murderer alone. Mrs. Bell was with me, Hamish said mildly, and Jimmy Anderson was just outside with 2 constables, hardly alone. That's not the point, Macbeth. The point is you went cowboy again, playing the hero instead of following procedure. Jimmy Anderson caught Hamish's eye and rolled his own in a gesture of solidarity. They both knew Blair was angry because the newspapers would give Hamish the credit, and Blair's superiors would want to know why he hadn't seen the pattern himself. The important thing is we've caught the killer, Anderson said diplomatically. 4 murders solved, justice for the victims. Well, Blair deflated slightly. I suppose there's that, but Macbeth, I'm warning you, next time you follow procedure, I'll have your stripes. After Blair had departed in a cloud of whiskey fumes and injured pride, Hamish walked through the village with lugs. News had spread, as it always did in small Highland communities, carried on the wind and the telephone lines and the conversations in shops and over garden fences. People greeted him with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that the killer had been caught, sorrow that it had been one of their own. Thomas Bell had lived quietly among them for 5 years, doing odd jobs, fixing electrical problems, seeming like any other decent young man trying to make his way in the world. No one had suspected that behind that ordinary face lay a killer who had murdered 4 men to protect his mother's secrets. At the bakery, Jessie Curry was holding court behind her counter, dispensing baked goods and gossip in equal measure. I always thought there was something not quite right about that young man, she declared, though Hamish distinctly remembered her saying Thomas was a nice, quiet lad just last week. Too quiet, if you ask me. It's always the quiet ones. Sometimes they're just quiet, Jessie, Hamish said, accepting the morning roll she handed him. And poor Mrs. Bell. What must she be going through? Imagine discovering your own son is a murderer. Though I suppose she brought it on herself, stealing from the church all those years. Mrs. Bell will answer for her crimes, Hamish said firmly. But let's not forget she lost her husband and now her son. That's punishment enough for any mother. Jessie had the grace to look abashed. Aye, you're right. I shouldn't speak ill. It's just such a shock to the whole village. At the police station, Hamish found Mrs. Bell waiting for him, accompanied by a solicitor from Strathbane. She looked as if she hadn't slept, dark circles under her eyes, and her usually neat appearance dishevelled. I wanted to make a full confession, she said without preamble, about the theft. I won't compound my sins by hiding from justice. Over the next hour, she detailed exactly how much she had taken from each parish, the circumstances that had led to the first theft, and the spiral of shame and fear that had kept her stealing, even after her initial need had passed. My sister's medical bills were real, she said. But once I'd taken that first amount, it became easier to justify taking more. There was always something, some expense I couldn't quite meet. And I told myself I'd pay it back eventually. that it wasn't really stealing if I meant to return it. Common justification, Hamish said, but theft nonetheless. I know. Her voice was steady now, as if confession had brought a kind of relief. I'll plead guilty up to all charges. I'll cooperate fully with the investigations into the other parishes, and I'll work to make restitution, even if it takes the rest of my life. What about Thomas? Will you testify against him? Pain flickered across her face. If I must. But Hamish, you have to understand, he did this because he loved me. His father died when he was so young, and he took it upon himself to be the man of the family. When he discovered what I'd been doing, he saw it as his duty to protect me. Love doesn't justify murder, Mrs. Bell, he hissed. I know that. God help me, I know that. But he's still my son, and I still love him, even knowing what he's done. After she left with her solicitor, Hamish sat at his desk and thought about the terrible complexities of love and duty, and the lengths people would go to protect those they cared about. Thomas Bell had committed monstrous acts, but they had sprung from a son's love for his mother, twisted and warped by loss and fear. It didn't excuse what he had done, but it helped explain it. The door opened and Dr. Jennifer Dalrymple came in, stamping snow from her boots. I've just come from examining Thomas Bell, she said. Physically he's fine, but mentally he's in a fragile state. Keep a close eye on him, Hamish. He's shown suicidal ideation. I'll make sure the custody officers know. Good, she paused. I also wanted to say well done. It can't have been easy, working out that pattern across multiple parishes. It was Jimmy Anderson who did most of the legwork. I just put the pieces together. Always so modest. She smiled slightly. It's one of your more annoying qualities, you know. Most police officers I've dealt with would be crowing about solving a serial murder case. I'm not most police officers. No, you're not, nor not. That's why Loch-Dubh is lucky to have you. After she left, Hamish dealt with the endless paperwork that came with a major case. Statements to write up, evidence to catalogue, reports to file. It was tedious. Work, but necessary, and he approached it with his usual methodical patience. Evening came, and with it a visitor he hadn't expected. Angus Fraser appeared at the police station, looking uncomfortable but determined. I owe you an apology, he said stiffly. I accused Mrs. Bell directly, nearly confronted her in the church. If Thomas had been there instead, if he had thought she was in danger of exposure, he might have killed again. But he didn't, Hamish said. And Mrs. Bell is taking responsibility for her actions. That takes courage. Aye, Angus shifted his weight. I've been thinking about what the Reverend said, about truth and transparency. He was right, you know. We've been too comfortable with our secrets here, too willing to look the other way when things were uncomfortable. Maybe if we'd been more honest, if we'd confronted problems instead of hiding them, none of this would have happened. Maybe, Hamish agreed. Or maybe it would have happened anyway. People make choices, Mr. Fraser. Mrs. Bell chose to steal. Thomas chose to kill. Those choices belong to them. But the village chose to look away when there were signs something was wrong. That choice belongs to all of us. After Angus left, Hamish locked up the station and walked to the church. The star still blazed atop the tower, its light unwavering despite everything that had happened beneath it. The church itself was quiet, empty, waiting for Sunday when services would resume and the village would begin the long process of healing. He stood in the darkness and thought about Reverend Munro, a man who had come to Loch-Dubh with ideals about truth and honesty and had paid for those ideals with his life. The Reverend had been right that secrets festered in darkness, but he had underestimated the lengths people would go to keep those secrets hidden. Still, his death had brought truth to light. Mrs. Bell would face justice. Thomas would answer for his crimes, and Loch-Dubh would have to reckon with its own complicity in allowing those crimes to continue. It wasn't the ending Reverend Munro would have wanted, but it was the ending his quest for truth had brought about. Hamish looked up at the star one last time, then turned and walked home through the snow, Lugs trotting faithfully at his side. Tomorrow there would be more paperwork, more questions, more painful reckonings, but tonight at least the immediate danger was past. The killer had been caught, the mystery solved, and Lockdoub could begin to heal. It would take time, Hamish knew. Trust, once broken, was slow to rebuild. But the Highlands bred resilient people, and Lochduber had weathered storms before. It would weather this one too. Chapter 10. Peace After the Darkness. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear, the kind of Highland winter day that made everything seem sharper and more vivid. Hamish woke early, made breakfast for himself and Lugs, and sat by the window watching the village come to life. Mrs. Bell had been charged with multiple counts of theft and released on bail, pending trial. She would plead guilty, her solicitor had assured Hamish, and would likely receive a suspended sentence given her cooperation and remorse. She had already begun the process of making restitution to the parishes she had stolen from. Thomas Bell remained in custody in Inverness, awaiting trial for 4 counts of murder. His confession had been detailed and unambiguous, leaving no room for doubt about his guilt. His solicitor was preparing a defence based on diminished responsibility, arguing that years of protecting his mother had warped his judgment. It wouldn't save him from prison, but it might reduce his sentence from life to something with the possibility of eventual parole. Hamish doubted Thomas would take comfort in that. The young man had looked broken when they'd last spoken, the weight of his crimes finally crushing the twisted sense of duty that had sustained him. The church services had been a matter of some debate. With no permanent minister and the church still bearing the shadow of recent events, some had argued for cancelling Christmas services altogether. But Angus Fraser, who had found an unexpected backbone since Reverend Munro's death, had insisted that the church remain open. "We need this," he had said at the hastily convened parish meeting. The Reverend died trying to bring truth and healing to this community. The least we can do is honour that by coming together, acknowledging our failings, and trying to do better. So services would proceed, led by a retired minister from Strathbane, who had agreed to help until a permanent replacement could be found. Hamish dressed in his best uniform and walked through the village with Lugs. The snow crunched under his boots, and his breath misted in the frigid air. Lights glowed in windows, and the smell of cooking drifted from various houses. Despite everything that had happened, Christmas was coming to Lochdubb. At the church, he found the doors open, and parishioners filing in slowly, many looking uncertain, as if unsure whether they had a right to be there after what had happened. The Christmas star blazed overhead, its light no longer sinister but simply constant, a reminder that some things endured regardless of human failings. Inside, someone had completed the nativity scene that Mrs. Bell had been arranging the night Reverend Munro died. The infant Jesus now lay in the manger, the figures of Mary and Joseph watching over him. It was a simple scene, but it carried a message of hope and new beginnings that seemed especially poignant given recent events. Hamish took a seat near the back, Lug settling at his feet, with a contented sigh. The church filled slowly, people greeting each other with subdued warmth, the usual Christmas cheer dampened by the recent tragedy, but not entirely extinguished. Angus Fraser stood to welcome everyone, his voice gruff but sincere. "We've been through a dark time," he said. "We've lost a good man who tried to show us a better way. We've discovered that people we trusted were capable of terrible things, and we've had to look at our own role in letting those things happen." He paused, looking around at the assembled faces. Reverend Munro believed in truth even when it was painful. He believed that facing our sins was the only way to move past them. So today, as we celebrate the birth of hope into a dark world, let's also acknowledge our own darkness. Let's commit to being better, more honest, more willing to confront uncomfortable truths. That's how we honour his memory. That's how we heal. The service that followed was simple but moving. The retired minister spoke about forgiveness and redemption, about the possibility of grace even in the midst of terrible failure. The choir, missing Morag Campbell, who had chosen to stay home, sang carols with more feeling than technical perfection. When it came time for the final blessing, Hamish noticed Morag slip into the back pew, tears streaming down her face. She had come after all, unable to stay away from the community that had been her anchor through years of grief and doubt. After the service, people lingered outside the church despite the cold, as if reluctant to leave. Hamish found himself surrounded by villagers wanting to thank him, to shake his hand, to express their gratitude for solving the case and their sorrow over what had been revealed. Jessie Curry pressed a package of shortbread into his hands. "For you and Lugs, you deserve something sweet after dealing with all that bitterness." Dr. Dalrymple stopped to speak with him, her manner as brisk as ever, but her eyes warm. "You did good work, Hamish. Difficult work, but necessary." Even Detective Chief Inspector Blair, who had returned for the service at the insistence of his superiors, managed a grudging nod. "Not bad, Macbeth, not bad at all." As the crowd dispersed, Hamish found Angus Fraser standing alone, looking up at the church tower and the blazing star. "Thank you," Angus said quietly, "for handling this with discretion. You could have made it much worse for the village." "No point in that," Hamish replied. "The guilty are being punished. The innocent don't need to suffer more than they already have. The Reverend would have appreciated that, I think. He wanted truth, but he also wanted healing." They stood together in companionable silence for a moment, two men who had started as adversaries and ended with a grudging respect. "Will you stay on as elder?" Hamish asked. "Aye. Someone needs to see this through. Make sure we find a good minister to replace Monroe, someone who'll challenge us but also care for us." Angus smiled slightly. "Someone who won't get murdered for doing their job." As Hamish walked back to the police station, the village seemed different somehow. Quieter, perhaps, more thoughtful. The easy comfort that had existed before had been shattered, but something else was taking its place. A harder-won peace built on honesty rather than convenient fiction. At the station, he found a message waiting from Mrs. Bell. She had left Loch Dubh that morning, gone to stay with her sister until the trial. But she had wanted him to know that she was grateful, that she understood he had done what was necessary, and that she hoped someday both she and Thomas might find forgiveness. Hamish thought about forgiveness as he sat by his fire that evening, Lug snoring at his feet. It was a complicated business in the Highlands, where memories were long and grudges could last generations, but it was also woven into the fabric of Highland life, this understanding that people were flawed and that grace was sometimes necessary for survival. Would Loch Dubh forgive Mrs. Bell? Eventually, perhaps, though it would take time. Would she forgive herself? That was harder to say. Would Thomas ever find peace with what he had done? Hamish doubted it, but stranger things had happened. Outside, the Christmas star continued to shine over the village, as it had throughout the darkness of murder and revelation. It shone on homes where families gathered, on the loch where water lapped against the shore, on the mountains that stood eternal and indifferent to human drama. Hamish thought about Reverend Monroe and his passion for truth. The man had paid a terrible price for that passion, but he had succeeded in forcing Loch Dubh to confront its secrets. Whether that was worth his life was a question Hamish couldn't answer. He suspected Monroe himself would have said yes, that truth was always worth the cost. Hamish was less certain. He'd seen what truth could do, the wounds it could open, the damage it could cause, but he had also seen what lies did, the way they festered and corrupted, the way they led to tragedies like this one. Perhaps, he thought, the answer lay somewhere in between, truth told with compassion, honesty tempered with mercy. That was what he tried to practice in his own work, and it seemed to serve Loch Dubh well enough. A knock on the door interrupted his musings. He opened it to find half the village standing outside, bearing plates of food and bottles of whiskey, come to share Christmas Eve with their constable. "You canny spend Christmas alone," Jessie Curry declared, pushing past him into the station. "Not after everything you've done for us." And so Hamish found himself hosting an impromptu Christmas party, his small station filled with people eating and drinking and talking. The conversation occasionally touched on recent events, but mostly it was about everyday things, fishing and weather, gossip and plans, the ordinary fabric of village life. As midnight approached and people began to drift home, Hamish stood at his door watching them go. The star still shone overhead, and the village lay peaceful under its light. There had been darkness, yes, and there would be more to come, but there was also this, community, connection, the stubborn Highland determination to carry on regardless of what life threw at them. Hamish closed the door and looked at Lugs, who had positioned himself strategically near the leftovers. "Well, boy," he said, "another Christmas in Lockdub. Not quite what anyone expected, but we got through it." Lugs wagged his tail in agreement, then returned his attention to the important business of looking pathetic in hopes of securing more food. Outside, the star blazed on, a symbol of hope in the darkness, and in the Lockdub police station, Hamish Macbeth poured himself a dram of whiskey and settled in for what remained of Christmas Eve. Peace, he thought, was a relative thing, but tonight at least it felt real enough, and for now that would have to do.